Hello, and welcome to JavaScript Marathon Training. We're so happy to be back with you again this month after our inaugural marathon training sessions back in April. My name is Tara Hampton, and I will be your host today. Today's session, we are going to learn why NestJS is becoming one of the most popular Node.js frameworks. Meet our trainer, Chris Whited. Hey, Chris. Chris is a software engineer, platform engineer, and blogger at Ultimate Courses. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
Yes. If you have any questions or comments after today's session, feel free to reach out to Chris directly on Twitter at the handle shown at the bottom of the screen. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is This.Labs, your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. You can find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with the constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies? This.Labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. And if you're familiar with this dot, you may already know that we put on weekly meetups online, covering various frameworks and topics each week. For the latest schedule and links to join, go to this.co. This dot's online meetups are an amazing opportunity for developers and enthusiasts alike to engage with the global tech community, no matter where you are in the world. That said, Chris, are you ready to take over? You want to share your screen for me?
Yeah. All right. As Tara said, my name is Chris Whited. I'm a software engineer here in the Kansas City region for a company called RFP360. And today we're going to be talking about building an issue tracker API with the NestJS framework. So to start, what is NestJS? So NestJS is a Node.js framework for building APIs that are server-side JavaScript, right? So Node.js allows us to build server-side JavaScript. NestJS is a framework that sits on top of that. It came out because we've had Express, we've had Fastify, Koa, Hoppy, all these different frameworks for a long time. And those have become like the de facto, especially with Express being a heavy one. But one of the things that was noticed is that there's not a lot of discussion around Node.js API architecture. And how should we design and build and architect an application that we want to be highly maintainable and highly scalable. So NestJS came around to kind of help with that problem. In and of itself, it sits on top of Express or Fastify to provide handy abstractions over these frameworks to help developers build Node.js APIs. And it does this with a mix of object-oriented programming practices, functional programming practices, as well as functional reactive programming practices to provide a full-fledged solution. I mean, incredible things like the ability to build REST APIs, obviously, GraphQL APIs, the ability to build microservices that can connect to each other and communicate over asynchronous messaging frameworks. I believe that there's some talk in the works of, it might be out now, about serverless frameworks using NestJS, and it also has some handy features for dependency injection and doing these kind of things. So direct from the docs, what they say about NestJS is NestJS provides an out-of-the-box application architecture which allows teams and developers to create highly testable, scalable, loosely coupled, and easily maintainable applications. So the idea behind it, and if you've done Angular before, it'll look very familiar to you as so NestJS gets a lot of its architecture and design philosophy from the Angular team and from the Angular source code. So when you see things like @component annotations or @service annotations, and the way it handles dependency injection, that's all coming from that Angular architecture design. Is Camille, the guy who was the primary developer creator of NestJS, saw some of those things in Angular and saw how they did really well for helping us architect and design a front-end application, he wanted to apply those to the back end and to the NestJS on the server, or to Node.js on the server side, and that's where we get Nest. So one of the advantages of this as well is that we get a CLI tool. And this is very helpful because just like with Angular, we can use this CLI tool to do a lot of very, very handy functionality, things like generating our application, things like generating components for our application and service layers for our application, starting, running, testing, all the cool things that we can do with Angular CLI. Well, there's generally an equivalent on the Nest side. So the big one obviously being Nest new with a given project name. And this allows us to generate a new app. So what are we going to do today? So today we're going to utilize the NestJS framework to build an issue tracker API. When you do these kind of things, I wanted to make something that was a little more broad than a to-do list kind of thing, and I wanted something that is inherent and that is used by a lot of developers all over the world, and some of that is in like an issue tracker, right? So think Jira or what's one that they just bought, Trello. Those kind of things where you define a list of tickets and you can assign somebody to a ticket and you can add comments to a ticket, and it's a chunk of work that needs to be done. So this is an idea that's very common, and I thought, all right, well, we can build an API with it. And I think it shows a lot of cool things for this use case. And so we're going to utilize NestJS and that framework to build an API that does this issue tracking. And so today what we're going to go over is using the NestJS framework to connect to our database. We're going to be using Postgres, creating data models and an ORM to interact with our database. So we're going to have TypeScript modeling our models that allow us to, think ORM. They allow us to connect and represent a table in our database. We're going to create a service layer to interact with our data layer and perform any necessary business logic and expose that out. And then we're going to create a controller layer to expose our REST endpoints. So today we're going to be doing a very simple REST API. And then we're going to build this into the module framework that NestJS prescribes to. That is how they architect and design their APIs. And then we're going to use that to have a simple API. Just a little bit of background. So this is our entity relationship diagram, our ERD, or our database. We're going to start with just 3 tables, keep it light. So we'll have a user that has some information about them. We'll have an issue, and this is a representation of a ticket in our system. And we'll have a relationship to our user, and then we'll have issued comments, and this is like a one-to-many kind of thing where we can add a comment to an issue and view a list of issues. Okay, so that's pretty much it as far as setup is concerned. Let's go ahead and dig into some code. So the first thing I'm going to do, like I said, is I'm going to generate our app using the Nest CLI. So if you don't have it installed, if you don't have the Nest CLI installed, it's very simple. Let me give you some... Let me zoom in here. So the first thing we'll need to do is we'll install the NestJS CLI. And this is an npm package, so we can install it like we do any. And we want to install this globally. So we're going to give it a sudo. And then we're going to say npm i-g at nestjs/CLI. I already have this installed, so this should be pretty quick. Not the right password. So here we go. I have this installed already, so this shouldn't take too terribly long. Cool. So now we have it installed. Let's validate that. We should get 7.4.1 from our Nest version, and we do. Okay. So now we're going to use this, and we're going to generate a new app. We'll call it Issue Tracker API to keep it simple. So we're going to say Nest new Issue Tracker API. And this is going to ask us a couple questions. Specifically the package manager we would like to use. I'm going to use Yarn. I prefer Yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on it. It's going to take a minute. So it's going to install the dependencies that it needs, as well as scaffold out the application. As you can see, it shows you the files that it's going to build. So I have an ESLinter Prettier with this. They recommend the use of Prettier, as do I. I'm going to use in VS Code, so I have the Prettier plugin installed as well. Then we'll have the Nest CLI. This is very similar to the angular.json file where we have, it just represents the structure of our app and information about the app that Nest in the Nest CLI utilize. Package.json, everybody knows about that. tsconfig, this is just how NestJS uses TypeScript out of the box. So this is just how we define our TypeScript configuration, and then some basic files. So if I open this file up, I'm going to open this in my VS Code window. Let me maximize that. I'm going to zoom in for y'all. I think it's just Command plus. It is. Okay. So as we can see, here's the files that we have. If we open up our package.json, it'll give us some scripts that we can get out of the box already. So like Nest build, we can format our files, we can start. So let's start it. Let's just start our application. So we're going to do a nice and easy Nest start. Or I could do yarn start here. So I can use the Nest CLI, or I can use yarn, which is going to provide a wrapper around Nest here, which is super handy. So in this case, I'm just going to use Nest start. As we can see, it started successfully. And we can know that I believe that the default port, if I open up my main here, I believe it's going to open on 3000. Yeah. So we get out of here and we go to 3000 and we get a hello world. Super easy. Nice and straightforward. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few of these initial files and talk about them really quick, and then we'll get added. We'll start adding our data layer connection and our configuration connection, and we'll talk about that. So this source / main.ts file, this is very, very important. This is the initializer. This is the bootstrap of our application. So in here we define our app, and then we start it, and then we call it to start listening, and we give it the port that we want it to listen on. We have some options in here of things that we can do. We could, right now, this is just a basic Nest app that's sitting on top of the Express framework. And because it's sitting on top of the Express framework, we're basically creating an Express app and then wrapping Nest around it, use it against our app module, and then listening on that. So let's add a few things. First off, I'm going to remove the support for Express, or I'm going to add support for Fastify. So if we look at the NestJS documentation here, we know that we can either support Express or we can support Fastify. We got to remember where it's at now. Performance, yeah. I like Fastify a little bit better than I like Express. It's not within our talking here, but I prefer Fastify. So I'm going to install it really quick. I'm just going to do a yarn add. I think it's what, at NestJS. Yeah, I'm just going to copy you. Come on. All right, with that added, I'm going to update my main file to now use Fastify instead of Express. And this is a super easy transformation that we're going to do here. I'm actually going to update my preview really quick. No, I'm not using an extra this example. Sorry, Devin. Someday. You can use, so NX is a monorepo design pattern, and they have first class support is what I would call it for NestJS. It's really, really, really handy. So if you are doing it, I would recommend it. Now with me passing in this generic here of the Nest Fastify application, now I'm going to make it a Fastify adapter. And now our app is using Fastify under the hood, and we still get the same thing. We are listening on port 3000. And I get a callback in here too. That's pretty handy. So I can get an error potentially. And I get access to the address. And from here, I can do something like this. I could have access to my logger. So NestJS has a logger that's really, really handy and provides a really cool logging standard. And so with it, you have access to, you can build your own custom logger on top of the default logger package, but you don't have to do that. So you can just import the logger here. So I think I can just do const logger equals, and I give it the context, which in this case would be this.name or bootstrap.name. So now I have a logger instance for this, and instead of using console.log, I can do logger.log. App is running, is started, and running on, I'll just give it an address. From there, I'll check for the error too. If error, logger.error, error initializing, or I guess error bootstrapping Nest or API. And we'll give it the error message. I think I need to make this a string. For that. Okay. So now if I start this again, and I'm going to use yarn start here, then I should get a message telling me that we started and that we're running on this address. Yep. So, whoop. Pretty cool. And the logger's pretty cool. So you can do other stuff in here. It's really interesting, actually, because the way dependency injection works in Nest, once you have this app instance, you can actually like use it to get dependencies that are injected throughout the application. So if you have like a configuration service that you know is going to be injected, then you can have like if you needed your configuration service because that's where your port was stored, right? For instance, like we're listing on port 3000, and you wanted to store that in your configuration. You could do that by after you initialize your app, you can use the app instance to get an injected dependency. So you could get your injected configuration service and then use that to grab your port, right? Not going to do that here, but it is an interesting thing because this app instance is very, very powerful. We can also do some other cool stuff with app. So we can apply some middlewares is what I'll call it. And we're going to say this is starting app. So in here we can do things like app.sets global prefix, right? I'm a big fan of like setting a global prefix of API on my REST APIs. So we could say /API, right? And so now every endpoint in our application now starts with /API. I don't think I need slash here, but now every endpoint starts with API. I can apply cores. Enable cores. And you can give it options like, I'm trying to remember what's all in here. What are my cores options? I think it's something as simple as origin. So I can give it any origin, any methods with the allowed headers, all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty cool too. So now I get cores enabled out of the box, and now I don't have to worry about cores or deal with cores. I'm going to give it origin. I'm just going to say all for now because I wouldn't recommend that in production, but in this case, it's pretty easy. You can say what allowed headers I want. Get, post, put. Oh, sorry with the dogs. Options being incredibly important because options is generally what actually fails on our cores requests. So now we have an app that also is enabled with cores. So it's super cool because you can apply a bunch of different stuff at this level. But that's all what we're going to do. So this is our main file. This is our bootstrap file, and it's incredibly important. So next what we're going to do is we are going to talk about configuration because we know that we need to connect to our database, and this is a perfect opportunity for configuration. So originally there was like in NestJS, this wasn't built in. This wasn't its own plugin or dependency that you could download. It was you had to like download .env, and then you would after you downloaded the .env module, then you have to create your own service and then they expose it to the dependency injection. But they realized that people kept doing that over and over again, and so they made it really easy. Where now you can just install this NestJS config package. So that's what we're going to do. Okay. Straightforward. And so now what we do is we are going to register this with our app module. Again, if you come from more of an Angular world, this will feel pretty straightforward because this will probably remind you of the app module in Angular as well. So we're gonna instantiate this and we're gonna initialize it as an import into our app module, and then we're gonna add a .env file, and we're gonna set some very basic stuff for our database user. So let me go in. I'm gonna create my .env file, and in here I'm gonna say db user. I created a user for this instance, but it's just gonna be me. I don't think I added a password, so this is just going to be empty. Well, I won't do that. Port. I'm using Postgres, so our port here is always going to be it's going to be 5432, not always, but it's 5432. Our address. So this is our host. In this case, it's just localhost because it's just running locally on my machine. And our database name is going to be issue_tracker. Okay. So now if I go to my app module, this is the next thing I want to talk about is modules in NestJS are like package by feature. So think of that design pattern where we have a feature that, and inside of that feature, we would have a module file that links all the things about that feature that we care about. So this could be our controllers, our services, our entities, our / model layers, all that kind of stuff. And so we link those and we bring those in as imports into our module. And then when if we want to share information between modules, we import another module into that module, right? So, and we'll see that later when I build a user module that will import into app, or if I build a the issue module, we'll build that into here as well. And again, like I said, very, very Angular and structure. But this is one of those things that like what's trying to be solved is this provides an architecture pattern for Node.js APIs. And when I first saw it, that was what spoke to me was like, and whether or not you love Angular, that's a different discussion. But like it gave us a pattern, and I felt like that was one of the things that, in my opinion, was maybe something that was more difficult or more up to the developer's interpretation when it came to Express and Koa and Happy. That I felt that Node.js did a pretty good job of saying like, here's an idea of an architecture pattern that we can use and we can scale and provides value. And I agree that it does. So I'm gonna configure. I'm gonna bring in my config module. So I'm gonna say import NestJS config, and give me my config module and config module dot for root. And there's options in here as well. Those I won't dig too deep into those, but they're pretty basic in that like what's is it a global thing? So that's what we want. Yeah, we want ours to be a global config. We want it to be available globally throughout our app. So is global is going to be true. Ignore env file. No, we don't want to do that. The env file path is going to default to .env in the root directory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty straightforward. The one that we're going to set here is global is true. So now we have access to our config, and we can inject a config service into somewhere and access our variables. And I'll get into that next, because the next thing we're going to do is add in support for our database connection through Postgres. They also provide, so one of the plugins that we have here that's very easy is with TypeORM. If you've not used TypeORM, it is like a TypeScript. It's a TypeScript object relational mapper. If you've used Hibernate, it's that kind of in that kind of vein. So in here, I'm going to add in the NestJS TypeORM module. I'm going to add TypeORM, and instead of adding MySQL like we see here, I'm going to add Postgres, or I think it's PG. I think it's just PG. I'm going to say yarn add at NestJS / TypeORM, and PG. Or PG2. Can't remember if he talks about it in here or not. Interesting. Okay, so those are installed, and so now in my app module, what I would like to do is I want to initialize my database connection in my app module, which basically says when my app bootstraps, it bootstraps from my app module, and part of my app module bootstrapping is that I want to import or I want to initialize my database connection and my connection pool. So in here, I'm going to say from NestJS / TypeORM. And here's kind of the way that we set it up. I'm gonna actually show a different way to do this, and I did this pretty recently, so I'm gonna look it up just to make sure that I follow the right thing here. Anybody else like the new GitHub look? I think it's incredible. Um, yeah. Okay, type ORM, and I also want type ORM module. Type ORM module options. So this is going to introduce another really cool concept here, and that's the concept of initializing an import asynchronously. And this is super cool because, so if again, like if we're thinking about this, we want to initialize our connection to our database. As we know, we stored our database connection variables in a .env file, and we want to pull those out. Well, that is an asynchronous action. So what we want to do is we need to initialize our type ORM module, which initializes our data connection. Using those values, we need that to be asynchronous. And Nest makes that very, very easily. So we are going to say for root async. And this gives us the ability to handle this in a few different ways. Like we could pass in a class if we wanted to. We could pass in a function that solves it. I'm going to do this inline because I think that there's just no reason not to right now. But because I need my config module and my config service, this gets its own layer of imports that it will bring in. So I'm going to import my config module, which gives me access to my config service, which I need to tell it that I'm injecting. So I'm going to inject my config service, and then I'm going to use this use factory, which is basically defining an inline function that's made to handle this exact thing. So I'm going to say use factory, and in here, in my use factory, in this function that I have any of my injected classes. So in this case, I have access to my config service. So I can say config service of type config service, and this is going to return a type module ORM, or sorry, type ORM module async options. So if I'm going to type that here, type ORM async options. Oh, I imported the wrong one. All right. So now, I can't do that. So this would have exactly what you'd expect. So not config service. Sorry, we want to look at what do we expect this to return. So we know that we want these connection options, and we could probably guess these kind of things. So what's the name of it? We're just going to say issue tracker. Database connection, sure. Our type, this is going to be Postgres. I don't know if I want this. So what are you expecting? No. Type, yeah, there we go. Postgres, sorry. Our host, this is our database host, and this is where it comes into play with our config service. We could say config service.get, and we tell it the type that we want this to return. In this case, this is a string, and we're going to say the property path, if we remember from our .env, is our host here. So we're going to say that's our host. We want a username, and we're going to use our config service for this as well. And we want this as a string, and this is going to be our DB user property. And then we want a port. I believe this requires it to be a number. So we're going to say config service.get, and we're going to say we want this as a number. And then we're going to give it db_port. I think, let's see, host username port. What else we got? DB name. Yeah. Okay, so we want this to be our name. Okay, that's on me. Okay, we want this to be config service.get string, and I think this was just db_name. We want to tell it how many retry attempts we want. This is like if you're trying to make a connection, how many times you try to make the connection before you give up. So we're going to tell it like after 3 attempts, go ahead and give up. So this is supposed to return. And we'll talk about entities here in a moment. I actually really want this to give me Oh, I can give it a schema too. That's cool. Sorry. So in this case, do I need anything else? No. Okay. I do want to synchronize. The synchronize is really cool because this gives us the ability to generate our objects in our table from our models, from our entities, which again, I'll get to in a second. I can remove that before we do. So now I'm going to try to make this connection. If this starts, that means that we have a valid database connection. Oh, see? Oh, I know what I did. I named my variables wrong. No, I didn't. I don't want that database. Okay, name. Let me create my database first. I can't remember if this will create it for me. So I'm going to do create database issue tracker. Okay. So now I should be able to see my database. Yeah, I'm going to create a schema in it. Issue tracker dot issue tracker. Yeah. Oh. Okay, I would assume it would. Yeah. Okay. So now I want to actually set my. Where are you? Here. I want to set my schema as well. So I want my name to be issue tracker. I want my DB schema to be issue tracker as well. So in here, I think I have, yep, schema, cool. ConfigService.get, give me a string, DB schema. All right, let's try to connect again. So give me the same thing. That's interesting. Let's do remove the need for this right now. I just want to test. Oh, that's not going to work. I need this. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what one of these things is looking for. Yeah, that's interesting. What am I missing? This name is the name of my connection. Wow. It's database that I want. Okay. So I'm going to go back to, man, let's get string. Yeah. The user exists. It was the database is the field that the property I was looking for. Okay. There we go. So now we're up, we're running, and we are connected to our database. Super cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build our first module. We're going to start with the user module. And inside of that, we are going to, inside our user module, the first thing we're going to do is define our user entity. So So in here, I'm going to create a folder, and we're going to call it user. And this is our package by feature approach. And here I'm going to say, I'm going to create another directory. Actually, I'm going to call it entities. And inside of entities, I'm going to create my user.entity.ts. And this is where we're going to define what represents our represents an entity in our framework, which is how we define, like, this is how the ORM works, where we can take a look at, where we can say, like, okay, we know that this is the structure of our table in the database, and we want our structure and we want this model to map that. Because I'm using annotations here, I actually have to make my my entities a class instead of like an interface or a type, which would be what I would usually prefer when dealing with TypeScript, but that's what we get. So in here, I need entity. Oh, it just comes from type ORM, yeah, not from NestJS. That's this. So I need entity, column, I think. No, column. There. Primary generated column. So this is going to be an ID. We're going to use a UUID. So I'm going to say at entity, and I give it some, I can give it some options in here like name. In this case, it does do a pretty good job of assuming, but I'm going to tell it my name of my table is user. So I'm going to say export class user, and I'm going to give it my primary generated column. I forget what UUID is in here. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to remember. I've done this before. What did I use? Or did I not? It's possible. Okay. So if I pass in my primary generated column, if I pass in, yeah, I can tell it what I want, like an increment, a row ID, or in this case, a UUID, which is perfect. So I'm going to say UUID of type string. Other fields that we want, if we remember from our model, we have a name. This is going to be email. This will be unique. It's their username. Unique, true, nullable, false. And I'm going to say email of type string. Column. Name. It's going to be name. It's going to be their name, user. This is not unique, but it is also not nullable. False. Come on. Our name. Then we have role. Come on. Role. You can use a enum here. I'm not going to for the sake of time, but you can use an enum here. This is nullable. It's going to be false. And we're going to give it also a default value. So we can say the default here is just user. So then we can say role string. I think that's good. That's probably good for now. So now we have this entity. This is very important because with this entity, we now want to tell our data connection that we have entities that we want it to load, and this will then go into the database and validate, like, okay, if I don't have this table, then I want to create it based off of this entity, and we can synchronize that. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to. I like this approach because I like the entirety of my application to be source control. So by doing it this way, that I'm controlling my source control. There's frameworks like Liquibase do this kind of thing as well, but this is one way to do it, and this is the way that we have to do it here. So I'm going to go in and say entities. You can do auto load. You can do with find my annotation. I like to be very explicit, so I'm going to give it the list of entities that I want to load here. So I'm going to say user entity or user, which will import from my. It'll import from the correct folder, and then I want to pop synchronize true. You can also set up like migration tables and stuff like that as well. So let's try this out. Assuming the best, this should create schema issue tracker does not exist. Oh, that's weird. Maybe I don't care about a schema, to be honest. Okay, so now if we check our database in here, wonder if it did create it under this. Oh, it did create it under Postgres. That's interesting. Where did it create the table? Okay. So now we have an entity, and we are going to then use a service to connect to it. So this entity is pretty cool because it does allow us, like, it allows a bunch of like CRUD operations to exist on our entity, and that's really handy, right? So now this is like a repo layer for us almost. So with it, we can use we can go into our service layer, which is what we're going to do now, and we're going to inject our repository, and then we have access to those repository methods. So if we go back to our API and we go to our user, we're going to create a user service. And in here, I'm going to import from NestJS /common. I'm going to import, what is it? Injectable. Injectable is like the annotation that allows for dependency injection. And I'm also going to import my entity from user entity, user. I need access to my inject repository, but I think that I'm just going to get this started and allow it. Injectable, and I'm going to say exports class user service. That's all I need. Yeah. I'm going to do a constructor here, and I'm going to say @inject repository, and I want it to be of my type user, right? So we want to say of type user. Excuse me, man. And then we're going to say private, not even, come on, read only, and then we're going to say user repo, and we're going to give this a type, and the type here is repository that takes a generic, so of type user. So we're going to say repository of type user. And then we have access to it. So now if we want to come in here, we can say like find one, right? So this would be like find by ID. So we could say find by ID, and we could give it an ID. We know this is a string because we are using UIDs. So then I'm going to return a promise of type user. So then in here I can just do return this user repo find one, and I pass in my ID. Cool. Now I can do find all. This is going to return a promise of a user array. Fine. So there's lots of those kind of methods. We could pass in options into here as well. So then if I do create, then I would expect to get a user here. So I want a user, and I'm going to return a user. And this is going to be return this user repo create user. Does that give me, it might be save. I think that this returns. Oh, okay. I know what the issue is. So in the case of a create, what we want is we know that our user here is an entity, so we can actually say something more like const created equals user dot what is it? I have to look it up. It is. Okay, we can just use save. Okay, so we can do save. Save is like an upsert, so it handles both create and update. So we can do here. Yeah, there we go. So this will return the user instance that is created. We're actually going to save some time to just saying save here. So we know that this is going to handle both instances. This could be a create or an update because it handles an upsert operation. Traditionally what we would have is we would have like the ability to validate our user. We want to make sure that it's a valid user, that it has all the fields that we expect. But this will also fail if it doesn't because we added that to our entity. So yeah, in that case, this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to build a controller here. And this controller is used to expose our routing endpoints for our application. So we can say controller, and we can then say we want to import our user service, and we also want to import our user. So in here, what we're going to say is user service. This is going to be entities, user entity. We're going to give it a user, and we're going to tell it our controller. And we can also, there's some cool stuff that you can do in here. I think you can provide it like a default route in your controller framework. So you can say, let's create our class first, user controller. I think that I can say user, and I think that means that every route within this controller is going to start with the prefix user. So now I want my constructor, and I need to inject my I need to inject my my app service or my user service. So we can say user service. And now I want basically the same thing, but now I'm going to expose endpoints to it. So I'm going to say @get, and then here, what's the path? Well, in this case, it's just a find all, so I don't really need a path. So I don't need to add anything to this, and I can just say find all, and this will return this dot user service dot find all, and this will return a promise of type user. Traditionally, I would use a DTO here, like a data transfer object, something that's not so close to what the actual entity is, but provides like maybe additional information about the user that we care about, or scrubbed information if we don't want to expose everything. For the sake of time, I won't do that. And now I'm going to say get, and this I do want an ID on. And so path parameters here are pretty cool because it allows us to say, like, we know that we have a path, and we know that that path contains this parameter, and that parameter is like ID, right? I think it's colon ID. I don't know why I keep adding that. Okay, so now this would be at user with a given ID. So this would be find by ID. And if we look at the docs, if we look at the docs, we know that in here when we pass in, we have access to that route. So we can say, we can then tell it like, okay, we want a parameter, and we're going to have access to that parameter via this annotation. So it's super easy to use. So we can say get, we know that we have this ID, so we need a param in here. And the name of that param is ID, colon ID matches to ID. And then we have, this is just a string. And we want this to return a promise of type user. This dot user service dot find by ID, and we pass in the ID. And so now, because we know that like in traditional, like when we have a create user, that would be a post. So now we can say post. And this is where we get into using like body. So we have create, I think it's that body. And this, we give it a name, like what's, oh, we don't need a name. That's correct. There's a lot in that doc. So this is going to be our user that gets passed as JSON over our request. We want this to be user. And we want this again to return a promise of type user. User service dot save user. Okay. So now we have basically everything we need in this feature except for our module. But again, if you think Angular, we know that the module is what's going to bring this all together. So we're going to say a user module. And just like our app module, we're going to bring in all of our imports that we need here. And we're going to, and then this is our exposed thing. So now something that's interesting is if you want to share like a service layer between different modules, you have to export that service layer as well. So from NestJS common. And this is our module. I'm going to import my user controller, and I'm going to import my user service. And I'm going to define my module, and in here I'm going to say imports. I don't actually have any imports, so I don't think it considers. So I provide it with my controllers, in this case my user controller, and my providers, in this case is my user service. And just, we're not going to use it because here, but this is what I mean. So if I put something as exports here, then that means I have access. If I import this user module, then I can have access to the user service. If I do not add this exports, then I don't have access to that user service, even if I import the module. And I'm going to do export class user module. And now I go to my app module, and I'm going to add this into my imports. App module. So in here, I'm going to add it below here. I'm going to say user module. So now if I start, oh, what's it yelling at now? Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry. So in my module, I have to declare my repo as well. So if I go to my module, okay, yeah. So that I give it with my type ORM module for feature, and then I give it the name of the entity that I'm injecting. So I need from NestJS type ORM. Type ORM module. I'm going to add it to my imports here. Type ORM module for feature. And this is my list of entities. In this case, it's just user. Cool. So now if I go to 3000, I can see here in my logs that I have access to those. I don't have a user, so I mean, this is just going to show an empty list. I'll just curl it, in fact. Slash API slash user, and I get an empty array. So let's see, it's 4:55 now. I'm going to leave some time for questions. I didn't get as far as I would like. What I can do is I can post some of the source code up. But what I wanted to highlight in this short time period was that, like, NestJS is really cool to me because I think that it does help me with or people who are come maybe from more of like a Java or a C# world when they're trying to make the switch to Node.js. There's a lot that is just like, where's the structure, where's the architecture, where's the design patterns. So I really liked NestJS when I first saw it, and I've used it quite a bit since because I think it provides a really cool answer to that problem. But I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts. Hit me up on Twitter at CMWhitehead. Sorry to get through more, but I think it's that concept that we just did, but we would just do that over and over, right? So, the next thing would be we'd have an issue module, and we define our issue entity and that service approach, and we could and then go through there. And I think that it's a really cool way forward, and I think it's a really cool product. And one of the things I like about Nest is that they're doing a lot continuously for it. Like I said, they're understanding the serverless side of the world where a lot of people are promoting that space and that framework, and they're working towards that. They use GraphQL. Their GraphQL module and plugin is incredible. It's really, really well done, where basically you just add it and then switch out controller with resolver, and then you get GraphQL out of the box, and it's incredible. That's what I recommend, and that's what I've used as well, and I have a few examples of that in my GitHub. But yeah, I really hope you learned something of like considering NestJS of like, it does help a lot to say like, this is a clean architecture pattern for Node.js server-side APIs. Anyway. Thank you all. Yeah.